There is a specific kind of disorientation that doesn't come from failure, loss, or exhaustion. It arrives quietly, without a clear event. You're still showing up. You're still capable. Nothing dramatic has broken. And yet, the thing that used to organize your days no longer responds to you. Effort doesn't connect. Motivation doesn't transmit. The internal machinery that once converted intention into movement now returns nothing. This isn't confusion in the usual sense. You can think clearly. You can explain yourself. You can even describe what's happening on the surface. What's missing is something more structural. A role you once inhabited no longer exists in the environment you're standing in. Not because you were removed from it, because the system itself changed, quietly, while you were still inside it. You're still here, but the position that made sense of your presence is gone. That gap between still being conscious and no longer being assigned is where this experience lives. And if you're in it, you don't need reassurance. You need accuracy. 1. Function is not identity until it is. For a long time, what you did and who you were felt interchangeable, not because you were naive, but because the system rewarded that fusion. Your actions generated feedback. Your role produced relevance. The world responded in ways that reinforced continuity. Over time, this created the illusion that identity was something stable and intrinsic. That illusion forms quietly. No one announces it. You simply notice that when you act in a certain way, things move. When you show up as a certain version of yourself, the environment responds predictably. There is alignment between effort and outcome, between intention and result, between presence and purpose. This alignment trains the nervous system to associate identity with function. Not consciously, but structurally. You didn't decide to become your role. You adapted to a system that confirmed you when you fulfilled one. In these conditions, identity feels solid because it is continuously reinforced. Each response from the world confirms a loop. This is who I am because this is what works. Over time, that loop tightens. The distinction between self and function blurs. You stop asking who you are outside of what you do because the question never becomes necessary. The system answers it for you every day through relevance. But identity, in practice, is rarely as intrinsic as it feels. It is supported by context, by demand, by structures that require you in a specific way. When those structures remain intact, identity appears durable. When they shift or dissolve, identity doesn't collapse immediately. It hesitates. That hesitation is what makes this phase difficult to name. When a function is removed, nothing dramatic happens at first. There is no clear ending, no obvious loss. You're still capable, still conscious, still present. You retain the skills, the habits, the internal orientation that once made sense. And because of that, your system keeps attempting to operate as if the conditions are unchanged. This is where the confusion begins. You continue thinking in familiar patterns. You continue offering the same internal posture. You continue applying effort in ways that once produced results, but the environment no longer responds. Not negatively, not with resistance, just with absence. No echo, no return signal. The loop that once reinforced identity has gone quiet. This doesn't feel like grief. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like misalignment without explanation. You're not experiencing loss in the emotional sense. You're experiencing a delay between cause and effect. The external structure has shifted, but your internal orientation hasn't recalibrated yet. The system that once confirmed who you were has stopped responding, but nothing inside you has clearly ended. That gap creates friction. Not pain, not panic. Friction. A low-grade sense that effort doesn't land, that presence doesn't register, that something you're offering is no longer needed, but you haven't been told what replaced it. You may find yourself repeating behaviors that once felt natural, only to notice they now feel oddly hollow. Not wrong, just ineffective. This is often misinterpreted as a personal issue. People assume something is broken internally because the feedback has stopped externally. They look for emotional explanations: burnout, depression, lack of discipline, loss of confidence. But those explanations don't quite fit. You're not exhausted in the usual way. You're not hopeless. You're not incapable. You're simply operating with an identity that no longer has a function to attach to. Identity lingers because it's not just an idea. It's a pattern. It's a set of expectations about how effort should translate into meaning. When those expectations are violated without explanation, the system doesn't immediately let go. It keeps trying, quietly, automatically, almost out of habit. This is why the early phase feels so disorienting. You're still oriented towards something that no longer exists, but you can't yet see that it's gone. There's no clear marker that says, this role has ended. There's just a growing sense that the environment is no longer shaped around you in the same way. The mind tries to compensate. It looks for errors. It asks whether you're doing something incorrectly, whether you've lost your edge, whether you need to try harder, adapt faster, optimize more. These questions feel reasonable because, in the old system, effort adjustments worked. But now, they don't restore alignment. The issue isn't performance, it's relevance. Relevance is contextual. It depends on systems that assign value to certain functions. When those systems change, relevance shifts with them. Identity, however, updates more slowly. It carries momentum. It assumes continuity. And when continuity is broken, it takes time for the internal map to reflect that change. This delay can feel unsettling because it leaves you without a clear reference point. You're not who you were, but you haven't become anything else. The old identity hasn't been invalidated outright, so it keeps asserting itself, but without external reinforcement, it starts to feel strangely insubstantial. You may notice a subtle erosion of certainty, not about your abilities, but about where they belong, not about your value, but about its placement. This erosion doesn't announce itself. It shows up as hesitation, as disengagement, as a sense that you're slightly out of phase with the world around you. Nothing is wrong with you here. What's happening is structural. Identity was being upheld by a function that no longer exists, and without that function, identity enters a suspended state. It hasn't dissolved, but it no longer generates the same coherence. Understanding this matters because it removes a common distortion, the belief that you must immediately redefine yourself, that you must force a new identity into place to replace the old one. That impulse often comes from discomfort with ambiguity, not from clarity. But identity doesn't update through force, it updates through context. When the context changes, there is always a lag, a period where the old patterns no longer fit and the new ones haven't formed. This period isn't a failure of adaptation, it's a necessary interval, a threshold. Seeing this clearly doesn't resolve the discomfort, but it does remove the confusion. You stop asking why motivation faded or why effort feels unrewarded. You stop assuming something inside you broke. You recognize that the system that once held your identity in place has moved on. And for now, your task isn't to replace that identity. It's to notice that it no longer has a function. That recognition is the first stabilizing point. 2. When feedback loops collapse, energy follows. Most people misunderstand what motivation actually is. They treat it as a personal resource, something you either have or don't have, something you can summon through discipline, belief, or pressure. But motivation is not a trait, it's a response. It emerges when the system you're operating in confirms that your actions matter. For a long time, your effort produced signal. You did something, and something came back. Progress, recognition, impact, movement, resistance. Even resistance counts as feedback. The nervous system doesn't require success to stay engaged. It requires information, a sense that energy spent is registering somewhere outside of you. This is how momentum is built, not through constant reward, but through consistent response. When that response disappears, motivation doesn't fade gradually, it shuts down with precision. This is the part most people get wrong. They assume motivation leaves because they've become tired, disillusioned, or weak. But what's actually happening is far more mechanical. The feedback loop has collapsed. Action no longer produces intelligible return, and without return, the nervous system conserves energy. This isn't apathy, it's regulation. Your system is designed to detect whether effort leads to consequence. When it does, engagement increases. When it doesn't, engagement withdraws. Not emotionally, biologically, automatically. The body reduces drive because continued output would be inefficient. That's why this phase feels so confusing. You may still want things conceptually, you may still care intellectually, but the physical impulse to move toward them is gone. You can think about action, but the internal pressure to act no longer rises. This creates a specific kind of discomfort. You're aware enough to notice the absence of energy, but not distressed enough to panic. You're not burned out in the classic sense. Burnout is loud. This is quiet. It's a flat line where intensity simply fails to generate. People often try to override this state with force. They push harder, they apply routines, discipline, urgency, but effort without feedback feels heavier than effort with resistance. Resistance at least confirms the system is still intact. Silence doesn't. When nothing pushes back, you're left exerting energy into a void. The nervous system learns quickly from that. It stops investing. This is why advice doesn't work here. Advice assumes the loop is still functional. It assumes that if you apply the right technique, energy will return. But techniques are built for environments where input-output relationships still exist. In a collapsed loop, technique has nothing to attach to. You might notice that even activities you once enjoyed now feel neutral, not unpleasant, just flat. This is often mistaken for depression, but there's an important difference. In depression, energy is suppressed regardless of context. Here, energy is context-sensitive. It returns briefly when something genuinely registers, then fades again. That fluctuation is a clue. It tells you the system isn't broken, it's selective. Your nervous system is no longer willing to invest in structures that don't respond. That selectivity can feel like loss, but it's actually discrimination. The system is refusing to generate momentum where momentum no longer makes sense. This refusal isn't conscious. You didn't decide to disengage. It happened beneath language, which is why self-talk feels ineffective. You can tell yourself to care, but the body doesn't listen. It's responding to data, not persuasion. This often triggers self-judgment. People assume they've lost discipline, that they're becoming lazy, that they're failing some internal test of character. But discipline doesn't disappear randomly. It disengages when the environment stops validating effort. In earlier phases of life, trying harder worked because the system still converted effort into signal. Now, the conversion rate is 0, and your nervous system knows it. This is where many people exhaust themselves unnecessarily. They keep trying to reignite motivation without addressing the structural issue. They interpret the absence of drive as a personal deficiency instead of a systemic change. The result is tension without traction. Understanding this doesn't magically restore energy, but it does stop the internal conflict. You stop fighting the absence. You stop interpreting it as decay. You recognize it as a response to missing feedback. This matters because motivation doesn't come back through pressure. It comes back when feedback returns, when effort once again produces consequence, when action lands somewhere real. Until then, the lack of energy is not something to correct, it's something to observe. You're not failing to move forward. The system you were moving within no longer supports motion, and your nervous system has adjusted accordingly. This is not a dead end. It's a pause enforced by reality, not by weakness. And until the loop reforms, conserving energy is not avoidance, it's intelligence. 3. The loss of role creates cognitive noise. When a role disappears, the mind doesn't go quiet. It gets louder, not with clarity, but with movement. Thoughts begin circulating without direction. Questions repeat without resolution. Analysis expands, but nothing settles. This is often mistaken for overthinking, but what's actually happening is something more specific. The mind has lost its anchor. For a long time, your role acted as a reference point. It organized perception. It gave your thoughts a direction to move toward. Decisions had a context. Judgments had criteria. Even uncertainty had boundaries. When the role was active, the mind knew what mattered and what didn't, because relevance was externally defined. When that structure disappears, the mind doesn't immediately update. It keeps scanning for the old coordinates. It assumes that if it thinks long enough, it will rediscover the missing alignment. But the alignment isn't hidden, it's gone. This creates a particular kind of cognitive noise. Thoughts don't feel wrong, just ungrounded. You can follow them, but they don't lead anywhere. You may find yourself revisiting the same ideas from different angles, hoping one of them will restore coherence. It doesn't, because coherence is no longer available through thinking alone. In functional systems, cognition works because it's tethered to action. Thought leads to movement, movement leads to response, response refines thought. When the role disappears, that loop breaks. Thought keeps generating, but there is no external response to stabilize it. The result is mental activity without resolution. This is why explanations stop working. You can explain your situation clearly to others. You can even explain it to yourself. But explanation doesn't produce relief. Understanding doesn't restore orientation. The problem isn't lack of insight, it's lack of placement. Without a role, the mind loses its hierarchy. Everything starts to feel equally relevant and equally irrelevant at the same time. Small decisions feel oddly heavy. Big questions feel abstract. You may notice a constant low-level tension, not because anything is urgent, but because nothing is anchored. This is deeply unsettling because the mind is built to categorize, prioritize, and resolve. When it can't, it interprets the state as instability. It responds by increasing activity, not decreasing it. More scanning, more evaluation, more internal dialogue. That increase is not a mistake, it's an attempt to regain orientation. But there is no amount of thinking that can replace a missing structure. And as that becomes clearer, thinking starts to feel exhausting. Not because it's intense, but because it's circular. You expend energy without progress. This is often where people begin to doubt their mental clarity. They worry they're becoming scattered or unfocused. In reality, their cognition is doing exactly what it's designed to do in the absence of grounding. Search. The problem is not that the mind is malfunctioning, it's that it's searching in an environment that no longer contains what it's looking for. Cognitive noise also feeds self-questioning. You might start to reinterpret past choices, wondering whether different decisions could have prevented this state. But this reframing assumes the role could have been preserved through better thinking. That assumption is comforting, but false. Roles don't disappear because of poor cognition. They disappear because systems evolve. The mind resists this idea because it removes a sense of control. If thinking can't fix the problem, then thinking loses its authority. That's threatening. So the mind keeps trying, even when it knows it's ineffective. This is why the noise persists. The important thing to recognize here is that clarity will not come from further analysis. Not yet. Clarity returns when a new structure begins to form, when there is once again a context that gives thought a direction to move within. Until then, the noise is not a sign of confusion. It's a sign of a mind operating without a frame. Understanding this doesn't silence the noise immediately, but it changes how you relate to it. You stop treating it as a personal failure or a mental flaw. You see it as a transitional state where cognition is temporarily untethered. And that matters, because when you stop trying to force clarity, the noise gradually loses its urgency. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes less dominant. The mind learns that scanning without anchoring won't restore what's gone. That learning creates the first real quiet. Not because you solved anything, but because you stopped asking the mind to do a job it can't do anymore. 4. Silence is a symptom, not a void. After the noise of searching and analysis reaches its limit, something else begins to surface. It doesn't arrive suddenly, and it isn't announced. It settles in gradually, almost unnoticed at first. The internal dialogue softens, emotional reactions lose intensity. The constant push to interpret, decide, or correct begins to fade. What replaces it is silence. This silence is often misunderstood. People assume it means something has emptied out, that motivation has died, that passion has drained away, that they have become detached or numb. But that interpretation comes from expecting the old system to still be active. It assumes silence is a failure of engagement rather than a change in conditions. In threshold states, silence is not absence. It is the nervous system responding to a lack of demand. When a role is active, the internal environment stays loud for a reason. There are signals to track, expectations to meet, adjustments to make. Thought and emotion remain in motion because they are required. The system stays alert because relevance is constantly being negotiated. When the role disappears, that requirement collapses. There is no longer anything insisting on immediate response. The nervous system registers this before the mind does. Without an active role, there is less reason to generate internal urgency, less reason to amplify emotion, less reason to narrate experience. The system downshifts, not out of resignation, but out of efficiency. It stops producing excess signal because there is nowhere for that signal to go. This is why the silence feels unfamiliar rather than peaceful. You are not resting. You are suspended. The quiet doesn't feel earned, and it doesn't feel chosen. It simply appears once the system recognizes that constant engagement is no longer necessary. What makes this silence unsettling is that it lacks meaning. In productive phases, silence usually follows resolution. A task is completed, a decision is made, an outcome is secured. Here, silence arrives without closure. Nothing has been resolved, nothing has replaced what's gone, and yet, the internal pressure has eased. This creates a strange contradiction. On the surface, nothing is moving forward. Internally, the system has stopped pushing. That mismatch can feel disorienting because it violates a familiar equation. Effort equals progress, and silence equals stagnation. But that equation only applies when a role is still operative. In this phase, silence is not stagnation. It's a signal that the old demands no longer apply. You may notice that emotions feel flatter, but not absent. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer pull you in the same way. Reactions occur, but they don't escalate. This isn't emotional shutdown. It's emotional non-amplification. The system is no longer inflating responses to meet external expectations. People often try to interrupt this silence. They seek stimulation, distraction, new goals, new narratives, anything that will recreate the familiar sense of pressure. But recreating pressure doesn't restore meaning. It only masks the quiet temporarily. The silence returns because it's not caused by lack of activity, it's caused by lack of demand. This is where many misinterpret the experience as emptiness. But emptiness implies something missing that should be present. In reality, what's missing is not content, but structure. There is no framework asking for output, so output recedes. Silence is the nervous system, acknowledging that the previous configuration has ended. It is not yet responding to a new one. It exists between those two states. Importantly, this silence is not asking you to fill it. It's not a prompt for reinvention. It's not an invitation to perform introspection more aggressively. It's simply a marker that the old internal rhythm no longer matches external reality. When you stop resisting this silence, something subtle happens. It becomes less threatening, not because it turns comforting, but because you stop interpreting it as a problem. You stop demanding that it explain itself. You stop expecting it to resolve into action. That shift matters because the silence cannot be forced to speak. Any attempt to extract meaning from it too quickly only recreates the noise from earlier phases. The silence holds because it is accurate. It reflects a state where old signals have gone quiet and new ones have not yet formed. Understanding this doesn't make the silence pleasant, but it makes it legible. You recognize that nothing inside you has disappeared. The system has simply stopped broadcasting because there is no longer a role requiring constant transmission. The quiet is not decay. It is not emptiness. It is the sound of a structure no longer making demands on you. And in threshold moments, that silence is not something to escape. It is something to stand within without trying to turn it into anything else. 5. Resistance appears without an object. After the silence settles in, another sensation begins to surface. It isn't dramatic, and it doesn't point clearly at anything specific. It shows up as a subtle reluctance, a quiet pullback. a sense that engagement requires more effort than it should. This is resistance, but not the kind most people recognize. There is no obvious enemy here, no clear obstacle, nothing actively blocking you. And yet, when opportunities appear, when invitations arise, when familiar paths open up, something inside you hesitates, not out of fear, not out of doubt, simply out of misalignment. This resistance confuses people because it lacks an object. You're not resisting a task, a person, or a situation. You're resisting placement. The system is registering that what's being offered no longer fits the internal configuration you're in. In earlier phases of life, resistance usually had a clear cause. You resisted what felt wrong, harmful, or demanding. That resistance carried energy. It came with emotion. Anger, frustration, anxiety. In this phase, resistance is quieter. It doesn't mobilize you, it slows you down. You may notice that things you once accepted without hesitation now feel heavy. Commitments feel weightier. Decisions feel less obvious. Even neutral activities can produce a sense of drag. Not because they are difficult, but because they are no longer aligned with the way your system is currently organized. This is not indecision in the usual sense. Indecision involves competing desires. Here, desire itself has thinned. You're not torn between options. You're unresponsive to them. That unresponsiveness is often misread as avoidance. People assume they're procrastinating or disengaging out of fear, but fear has a direction. This resistance doesn't. It's diffuse. It shows up as delay, without anxiety, withdrawal, without relief. What's actually happening is that your system has stopped orienting around the old incentives. The things that once pulled you forward no longer generate traction. The internal signal that says, "This matters," fails to activate. Trying to override this resistance creates tension. You can force yourself to say yes, to move, to engage, but the movement feels hollow. Effort is expended, but it doesn't connect internally. You go through motions without resonance. The resistance doesn't disappear. It goes underground. Ignoring the resistance creates a different problem. When you bypass it completely, exhaustion follows. Not physical exhaustion, but a deeper fatigue that comes from repeatedly placing yourself where you don't fit. The system registers this as misuse of energy. Neither forcing nor ignoring resolves the issue because the resistance is not a problem to solve, it's a signal to interpret. This resistance exists because the internal map has changed, even if you can't yet articulate how. Your nervous system is no longer calibrated to the same structures. It's detecting subtle mismatches between who you are becoming and where you are being asked to stand. This is why the resistance feels vague. The future isn't clear enough to orient toward, and the past no longer provides direction. You're in between, and resistance is the body's way of slowing movement in a space where orientation is unstable. People often rush to eliminate this feeling because it's uncomfortable to remain unresponsive. In cultures that value momentum, resistance is treated as failure, but momentum assumes a stable direction. In threshold states, direction has dissolved. Resistance here is protective. It prevents premature commitment to structures that would recreate the same collapse later. It holds you in place long enough for the mismatch to become visible. This doesn't mean you should wait passively or refuse all engagement. It means the resistance itself carries information. It tells you that the old routes no longer correspond to your internal configuration and that moving forward blindly would be an act of denial rather than progress. When you stop treating resistance as something to defeat, it changes texture. It becomes less frustrating, less personal. You no longer interpret it as a flaw in your character or a weakness in your will. You see it as a boundary signal from a system that is recalibrating. This recalibration cannot be rushed. Resistance will persist until placement makes sense again. Not until you convince yourself to move, but until movement aligns with something real. In this phase, resistance is not blocking your path. It is preventing you from stepping onto the wrong one. 6. Self-blame thrives in transitional states. As resistance continues and clarity remains out of reach, the mind looks for something stable to attach responsibility to. When the environment no longer provides clear explanations, self-blame becomes the default anchor. It offers a simple narrative in a situation that otherwise refuses to resolve. If something feels wrong and nothing external explains it, the conclusion seems obvious. The fault must be internal. This is where many people quietly turn against themselves. Self-blame does not arrive as harsh self-criticism at first. It starts subtly. You begin to question your discipline, your consistency, your mindset. You wonder whether you missed an opportunity, failed to adapt fast enough, or allowed complacency to set in. These thoughts feel reasonable because they resemble accountability, and accountability has worked for you before. In previous phases, adjusting your behavior restored alignment. So the mind assumes the same logic still applies. But that assumption is outdated. Self-blame thrives here because the role hasn't clearly ended. If something had visibly collapsed, a job lost, a relationship ended, a project failed, blame would have a clear target or a clear boundary. You could locate the ending, you could grieve it, explain it, or contextualize it. In threshold states, there is no clean ending. The role dissolved quietly. Without a visible cause, the mind fills the gap with internal explanations. This is not honesty, it's pattern completion. The mind prefers a painful explanation over an ambiguous one. Blame creates coherence. It allows the system to believe that control still exists, even if that control is expressed as fault. If it's your failure, then theoretically, it can be fixed. If it's structural, then you must tolerate uncertainty. Most systems choose blame because uncertainty feels more threatening than guilt. What makes this phase particularly difficult is that self-blame feels productive. It feels like you're doing something, evaluating, correcting, holding yourself to a standard, but nothing changes. The more you analyze yourself, the less aligned you feel. The more responsibility you take, the heavier the stagnation becomes. This creates a loop. Lack of movement triggers self-blame. Self-blame increases internal pressure. That pressure tries to force engagement. Engagement fails because the system no longer supports it. The failure reinforces blame. The loop tightens. At no point does this loop restore function, because the problem was never performance. What self-blame cannot accept is that you can do everything right and still lose relevance within a system that has evolved. It cannot accept that roles expire independently of effort. That identity can become obsolete without error. That competence does not guarantee continuity. This challenges a deeply held belief that effort ensures placement. For much of your life, that belief was accurate. Effort led to mastery. Mastery led to relevance. Relevance reinforced identity. But that logic only holds while the surrounding structure remains stable. When the structure shifts, effort alone cannot preserve alignment. Self-blame ignores this reality because acknowledging it would require letting go of a familiar source of control. Another reason self-blame intensifies here is because nothing external is demanding you anymore. Without external pressure, attention turns inward. You become hyper-aware of your internal state. Energy levels, focus, mood, motivation. Normal fluctuations begin to feel like indicators of decline. You monitor yourself as if you're a system that should be producing output on schedule. But output is no longer being requested. This is where self-blame becomes particularly corrosive. You start measuring yourself against a standard that no longer applies. You judge your current state using criteria designed for a role that has already ended. Of course, you come up short. The measurement itself is invalid. Self-blame also feeds the illusion that you are falling behind, that others are moving forward while you are stuck. But forward only exists relative to a path. If your path has dissolved, comparison loses meaning. You are not slower, you are unassigned. Understanding this doesn't eliminate self-blame immediately. The habit is deeply ingrained, but it weakens its authority. You stop treating every lapse of energy or clarity as evidence of failure. You begin to see these experiences as symptoms of transition rather than proof of inadequacy. This distinction matters because self-blame drains what little stability remains. It consumes attention and energy without producing insight. It keeps you oriented toward a past structure, constantly asking why you can't re-enter it, instead of recognizing that re-entry is no longer possible. Releasing self-blame does not require self-compassion rhetoric. It requires accuracy. The accuracy is this: you cannot perform a function that no longer exists, and you cannot stabilize an identity inside a structure that has already dissolved. When you see that clearly, self-blame loses its leverage. It no longer explains anything. It no longer offers a solution. It becomes noise rather than guidance. And as that noise fades, something important becomes possible. You stop fighting yourself for not moving. You stop trying to fix what isn't broken. You allow the transition to be what it is, a period where the old frame no longer applies and the new one has not yet formed. That allowance does not resolve the uncertainty, but it removes the unnecessary weight of guilt from an already unstable moment. And in threshold states, removing what doesn't belong is often the only real progress available. 7. Being unassigned is not the same as being lost. At some point in this process, a quiet but persistent fear begins to surface. It doesn't announce itself as panic. It doesn't even feel dramatic. It shows up as a background assumption. If I don't move soon, I'll disappear. If there is no role, no direction, no visible trajectory, then surely something has gone wrong. Surely this state means you are lost. That assumption feels natural because most people are taught to interpret stillness as failure. Movement is treated as proof of existence. Direction is treated as evidence of worth. When both disappear at the same time, the mind rushes to fill the gap with meaning, and the most available meaning is loss. But being unassigned is not the same as being lost. Being lost implies there is a destination you were supposed to reach and failed to find. It assumes the map still exists, and you simply deviated from it. Being unassigned means something else entirely. It means the map no longer applies. The coordinates that once defined progress have dissolved. There is no correct direction because the system that made direction meaningful has ended. This distinction is critical because treating unassignment as loss creates unnecessary urgency. It pushes you to reattach too quickly, to claim a new role before the internal structure is ready to support it, to mistake motion for resolution. In this phase, many people attempt to restore stability by adopting substitutes, new identities, new goals, new narratives about who they are becoming. These substitutes can provide temporary relief because they recreate structure, but they often collapse just as quietly as the previous role did because they were chosen to escape uncertainty rather than reflect reality. The threshold state resists this kind of replacement. It exposes when an identity is being used as scaffolding rather than expression. That resistance can feel cruel, but it serves a purpose. It prevents you from rebuilding on a foundation that hasn't settled yet. Being unassigned means there is currently no role asking for your full engagement, no position demanding output, no structure requiring you to be a specific version of yourself. This absence is uncomfortable precisely because it removes external confirmation. Without a role, there is no mirror constantly reflecting who you are supposed to be. This is where the fear intensifies. Without reflection, identity feels less real. You may worry that without function, you will fade, that your presence will lose substance. But presence does not depend on assignment. It never did. Assignment only made presence visible. The problem is that visibility has been confused with existence. When roles are active, existence feels reinforced because it is constantly acknowledged. When roles disappear, existence becomes quieter, less defined, less affirmed. That doesn't make it weaker. It makes it less mediated. This is one of the hardest truths to tolerate. Not every phase of life is meant to be legible. Not every state is meant to produce signal. Some states exist outside performance entirely. They are not transitional because they lead somewhere quickly, but because they loosen what has hardened. Being unassigned places you outside familiar metrics. Productivity stops measuring worth. Progress stops defining time. Comparison loses coherence. This can feel destabilizing, but it also removes pressure that was previously invisible. You begin to notice how much of your identity depended on being needed, not on being aligned. This is why the threshold state often feels empty even when nothing is missing. The emptiness is not lack, it's lack of demand, and without demand, the self is no longer pulled into shape. That shapelessness is frightening because it teaches you something most systems avoid acknowledging. Identity is not always active. Sometimes it is dormant. Sometimes it is reorganizing beneath awareness. Sometimes it exists without expression. Trying to force expression during this phase usually leads to distortion. You end up performing fragments of past identities or borrowing language from futures that haven't arrived. Neither stabilizes you. Both increase the sense of falseness. Stability returns not when you find a direction, but when you stop assuming that direction is required, when you allow the state of being unassigned to exist without interpreting it as error. This does not mean nothing will change. It means change cannot be commanded from here. It must emerge from conditions that have not yet formed. And those conditions cannot form if you are constantly trying to outrun the pause. Being unassigned is not a void you fall into. It is a suspension you stand within. It is the interval where old definitions no longer hold you in place, and new ones have not yet earned legitimacy. If you are here, it does not mean you failed to become something. It means the structure that once named you has released you, and nothing has yet taken its place. That is not loss. That is a boundary. And standing at a boundary does not require movement. It requires recognition. If you've reached this point and nothing inside you feels resolved, that's not a problem to solve. It's a signal that resolution isn't available yet. The role that once organized your effort has ended. The systems that confirmed your identity have gone quiet, and no replacement has stepped forward. There is a strong impulse to interpret this as absence, as if something essential has been removed. But what's actually missing is instruction. No framework is currently telling you who to be or how to move. That can feel unsettling because it leaves you alone with your own presence, without reinforcement. This is not a failure of direction, it's a pause in assignment. Nothing here needs to be accelerated. Nothing needs to be named prematurely. You don't regain stability by declaring a new identity or forcing momentum. Stability returns when the mismatch is no longer denied. You are not behind. You are not disappearing. You are simply standing where the old structure can no longer reach you, and the new one has not yet made contact. For now, that is not something to fix. It is something to recognize and to remain with, without trying to turn it into anything else.